Okay, so emotional abuse, just a really big bare bones definition of what emotional abuse is. It's the emotional abuse or psychological abuse that a child undergoes, and it can be done in several ways. But it's very, very continuous and persistent, and it's more than just not making the child feel bad about themselves. It's kind of deeper than that, don't you think, Lori?
Oh, I would agree. Definitely deeper than that. You can have just lifelong implications.
Yeah. Um, Now, I guess emotional abuse just in general is kind of something easy that we have parents come in and complain about, well, they're just emotionally abusive because, emotional abuse it's it's sometimes hard to spot. So it is one of the harder types of abuse to, kind of convince the court of. Is that something you've experienced?
Well, definitely, because there aren't any physical signs. Physical abuse, there's a bruise, there's a broken leg, there's something physical, there's a mark, and emotional, there's just not. So it's very difficult, in my opinion, to prove whether or not somebody has hurt feelings, and whether or not that's going to be long lasting for them is really hard to tell. So a lot of times I think it goes in conjunction with some other sort of type of abuse, but that is a very difficult one when parents call and say that they're being emotionally abused. It's just so difficult to prove without putting this little kiddo on the stand and having them testify, because you sure don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So it's just real difficult to prove, I think.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I always tell people who are coming in saying the other parent's being emotionally abusive, I'm telling them we need to go put them with a therapist right now, because you can say it all you want, but a court really is going to look for that professional to let you know. And that professional is going to kind of tell you, I guess, kind of putting us into the next box, the type of emotional abuse that the child is facing. So I guess in the next box, there's 3 types that we have listed there. It's humiliation, which is the constant belittling and criticism, which I think humiliation is kind of the tougher one to really stick down. But there's also threats, such as, shouting, threatening to, harm them, or, name calling. And there's also sarcasm, which is often brushed off by parents saying, finding what they would say a funny way of calling the child maybe stupid and saying, oh, it was just a joke, and hiding it that way. But really, that is kind of damaging.
And one other thing under threats is making threats to others. Threaten to hurt their other parent, threaten to hurt a sibling, an animal, and making the child fearful in that way.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's one that, I guess kind of where we're from, where we've had cases where they make threats to hurt other people. We would deal with that kind of in the realm of like a protective order, maybe in that way. But they're always so hard to prove that it was even said, unless it's like in a text message. And 9 times out of 10, they're not going to put that in writing in a text message. So that's also another thing about emotional abuse is it's not really written down 9 times out of 10. So it's really, really difficult. I guess the other 3 types would be scapegoating, which is, just having something happen but using the child as the reason that it happened. Degradation, forcing demeaning actions on them. And I think that kind of goes with that sarcasm. Like it's, oh, it's a joke though, but it's really not to the child. And then there's control, manipulating and or restricting individuality. That's definitely hard. I think that goes hand in hand when you have children who are of maybe LGBTQ community, and that, not accepting them for who they say they are. I think I see that a lot, especially with teenagers as they're getting older.
I would agree with that. And I had a case where the guy would just tell the child, you're going to get strawberry ice cream. Always. And it's like, the child didn't want strawberry ice cream, but it was just one of those things of controlling just something oddly specific that just got old after a period of time, that it to a point where it got abusive.
Yeah. And I think one thing about that control factor is when people split from their partner and they're so used to controlling that partner. Once they're split, they have no way to control that partner, that former partner now. The only way to control is the child. And it hurts that partner to, hear those things that it's still going on. So then there's also other types, which is negativity and emotional neglect. Always being negative. I know we always do see that in our lives, like, oh, we can be more positive, but no, constant negativity towards a child whose brain is developing, that really does weigh down on them as a person. And then I think one thing that we also, like going back to what we said earlier, having parents come and say, oh, my child is being emotionally abused, and taking them to the therapist, that's really important. It's that at that point, it's really important for them to actually take them to the therapist so they can, really look at the child and identify the signs. And when they have those conversations with the child, that's what they're looking for. So some signs of emotional abuse are, appearing excessively withdrawn, anxious, fearful, exhibiting extremes in behaviors, delayed emotions or weak caregiver attachment. Some additional ones are low self-esteem, low self-worth, having difficulty forming or maintaining relationships, and demonstrating inappropriate emotional responses. They don't know how to react to certain things because they don't have that emotional maturity to do so, because what they've been shown by the parent that is exhibiting emotional abuse is the way to react to situations are to either be over exaggerative. They're never on mark, like kind of know what I would say growing up, mom, this punishment doesn't fit the crime. Their reaction doesn't fit this, the scenario that's going on.
And that's one good thing about therapy and them just children getting into therapy. They can learn how to react and how to deal with situations that they're uncomfortable with, even if it's with a parent.
Yeah. I think also some big effects of emotional abuse are the brain impact. Like I said earlier, their brains are developing. So if their brains aren't fully developed and they're learning this negative response, that really does hinder their brain growth, and it kind of alters the way you can see it. And I guess I've watched some documentaries and I've seen them do scans of people's brains who are emotionally developed and brains who are not. And there's actually a really big difference scientifically. To get some support in reporting emotional abuse, like we said, get them in with the therapist. If the emotional abuse is coming to where the child is going to want to harm themselves, definitely reach out to the authorities, and always make sure you listen to them. And that's going to kind of be a theme throughout our whole talk here about different types of abuse.
I do think that one, I know we need to move on to the next one, but listening I think is such an important one for the parent to just sit and listen to what's being said and not assume the child's going to tell the rest of the story as the parent may remember it from when they were together, but truly listen to the entire conversation of what's been going on.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think to add to that, I think a lot of times parents don't want to hear that could have happened to their child. But if they're telling you, just kind of in a second. So the next one that we're going to talk about is physical abuse. Unlike emotional abuse, physical abuse, is often easier to spot. Physical abuse is when someone is intentionally harming the child. And it also includes making up symptoms of illness or causing the child to become unwell. That's, I guess, what we would refer to here as Munchausen by proxy. That's the one that we use. Have you ever had a Munchausen case?
I honestly currently have somebody accusing somebody of that right now. I don't think that applies in this case, but no, I've never dealt with one to that extreme. No.
Yeah.
Abusive people, yes, but not fake abusive people where they're trying to put it onto the child and make it seem like that. No, I've never had that.
I used to work at the Children's Hospital here in Texas, in Houston. And I've seen it, and it's insane. Like, these people are so cunning. You don't it seems like they're so on top of it, right? But in reality, they're altering things. You're just like, that was going on this entire time. So obviously, the earlier we catch it, the better. But I think that is the hardest form of abuse to recognize out of any form of physical abuse, in my opinion. Signs of physical abuse, as we know, the bumps and bruises, those are really common in young children, especially if you have a toddler who's running around getting bumps and bruises. So you kind of have to think about, is this common toddler behavior or is this actual abuse? Have you ever had a case where, they thought it was abuse, but ended up not being abuse?
Well, that comes up, I think, a lot, especially like you said, with the younger or boys in general, not to stereotype, but, typically the younger kids, they fall.
Yeah.
And you'll get the toddler that comes back, oh, they have a bruise on their head and they want to call CPS. It's like, he's a year and a half. Of course he fell. That's what they do. Now, does this happen? You have to kind of then question, is this every time he comes back with, that's something different. If every time they're coming back with a cut or having been to urgent care for stitches, that's different than kids fall. Boys fall off their bikes. Girls fall off their bikes. They fall out of trees.
Yeah.
It happens if you want them to be a child and not live in a bubble. So there is I think, not necessarily a fine line. I think, but you have to it has to build, unfortunately. That one instance of a bang on the head isn't going to get you there. It has to continually happen, or different things have to happen over and over and over again. And a lot of times that ties in with emotional abuse. The kids will get blamed for things that happen. But you do have to be careful when you're listening to these stories and seeing the pictures to just jump to the conclusion that it's physical abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the last thing you want is to accuse a parent of something they didn't do. Because somewhere down the line, if something really does happen, you're going to be the parent that cried wolf all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not where you really want to be. Some more signs of physical abuse or broken bones. I think burns are a really big one. Bite marks. But then again, if you have a toddler who goes to daycare and, they're biting each other, it's like, whoa, okay, the parent didn't do this. This kid is in daycare, and we have the daycare reports to show that. So little Timmy over there is a biter, and they had a little scuffle. So that's one that I've experienced myself. Scars, like you were saying earlier. Symptoms of poisoning. I haven't had a poison case yet. Vomiting, drowsiness, sometimes seizures. Breathing issues from drowning or suffocation may also indicate abuse. So just kind of keep an eye out.
Keeping records, I think, is important too. Like I said, don't just report the first incident, but kind of keep an ongoing record.
Yeah, I agree. Again, if the child was, says, is, confiding in an adult saying, yeah, I've been abused, just kind of and let them get their whole spiel out. One thing I have noticed is I had someone come to me and her daughter finally confessed that, something was going on at dad's house with a step sibling. And it was just like, the mom just kept saying, well, why didn't you? I'm like, no. You get out for a second, because we're not going to do the why did you game. We're not going to victim blame here. That's a big thing that I think. The effects of abuse. Physical abuse can have long-lasting effects on children and young people and can lead to poor physical and mental health later on in life. I guess, have you ever seen someone on the adult end of it?
Well, yes. And I do send those without the proper, training is not the word I want to use, but it's therapy. Without the proper type of therapy, these kids often grow up to get abusive boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives. And when you get to the 30, 40-year-olds that have been abused for 20 years in some marriage, it often will go back to them being either abused or witnessing abuse when they were younger. Not always, but there is often a correlation there if they don't get some sort of therapy.
Yeah, and I think also, I guess, I've had cases where I've represented the abuser, and you're looking at it and I say, well, what happened to you in your childhood growing up? Because typically when you're representing the abusive partner, you're having there's a criminal case that's also going along with it, right? So you're just like, what happened in your childhood? And 9 times out of 10, there was some form of severe emotional abuse. My dad always came home drunk telling me I'm stupid, or physical abuse in the house, and I guess that will kind of segue after a few more of these little boxes we're going through into the domestic violence portion of that we're going to talk about. But I definitely see it even when I represent the abuser as well. Shaken baby or infant, I think that's really important to talk about because, people break up and the child is 4 months old. How do we weigh where the child is going to go to be safe and or not? So that's a really big one. I don't know if you've ever had a case with that in there.
I have, and those are just tricky just because children can't talk and they can't tell you what happened. So then it's just a lot of guessing as to what happened, and you kind of have to at that point go by the physical injuries that are there. It's just it's real hard to you start assuming a lot, and that can just get dangerous.
And you don't want, but you also, it's kind of hard because you don't want to be the parent who cried wolf, but you also don't want what the worst thing possible is that could happen, them not waking up or having any brain activity. So I get it. And I, kind of where we are, we have different laws in relation to how long the non-custodial parent will be. And there's, time limits that we can put in place, but I get it. Just, I think what's important to wrap up this portion of it is physical abuse can occur to anyone in the family. But there are certain stressors that bring it out more, which are, poverty, substance abuse, mental illness issues, and relationships issues. They make it harder to provide a safe, clean environment and loving environment. And I'm not saying just because you fall within one of these categories, you're abusing your child. That's not what we're saying, but there are definitely some things that can lead to it more than others that helped, So I guess we're going to go back up here and segue into our domestic abuse. The definition of what is domestic abuse? It's controlling, bullying, or violent behavior between individuals in a relationship and can severely harm children and young people. And raising a child in a domestic and a household that has domestic abuse, that is its own form of child abuse. So I'm sure you've had a million cases wrapped in there.
A whole bunch. Yeah, that unfortunately is very common. And it is one of my standard answer or questions when I'm taking in a client. Has there been any calls to the police? And sometimes there'll be a hesitation there, like, okay, should have there been calls to the police?
Yeah.
Or were there instances where things have happened, and you kind of got to get really detailed with people. Has he ever hit you? Well, yeah, but it was only once. Okay, well, okay, that's a problem. Some people just don't recognize that once is enough. Or then you start really questioning. There's a lot of financial control, which is a type of abuse, and that's kind of a lot of things that happens in the domestic abuse where the kids get caught up in it. The parent can't buy for just food or clothes or whatever is necessary. In some instances because of that. So it's just, I think that's something unfortunately we deal with a lot.
Yeah. And also, what is it? I've had a couple cases where I'm like, okay, did he hit you? And she goes, yes. And I go, where was the baby? Oh, the baby was in the room, but they weren't paying attention. No, your kid's 5. They know what's going on. They know a lot more than you think. And I think that's really hard part, especially because especially when I'm dealing with a mom who has such guilt. She wants to keep the family together, but not realizing that, in certain places, especially in some states here in America, knowingly staying with a spouse that's domestically abusive, especially physically abusive, that could lead to you losing your children. They can all just be removed until you make the decision to assist in providing a safe space. And I don't like that, but at the end of the day, some jurisdictions can't control what you do as an adult, but we can control where these children are. And that's what they're going to do.
And one other thing, I've had several men that have been abused by women. And that's something that's just very difficult usually for them to admit. But that's something you have to learn to listen. And children see that, the kids are there, even if they're in the next room. They can hear. The walls aren't that thick anywhere.
True. True. I've had one male that I had to tell him he was abused, and he didn't even realize it. I said, no, 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 because if a man did that to a woman, it would be like, are you kidding me? He's like, well, she doesn't hit that hard, it doesn't hurt me. I'm like, that's abusive. That is abuse, and your child sitting right there, you need to take your child and leave, because that's not appropriate. That's a form of child abuse. I guess some signs of domestic abuse are aggression, anxiety, depression, children who throw excessive tantrums, attention-seeking behavior, withdrawal, trouble at school, eating disorders, and physical symptoms like bedwetting or frequent sickness. The eating disorder ones, when I worked at the children's hospital, I came across a lot of children who had eating disorders, and 9 times out of 10, something crazy is going on at home, you know? And that one is a big sign. Children with eating disorders, 9 times out of 10, it's physical abuse at home and or sexual abuse at home, or somewhere that has happened to them, and eating is their way of controlling a situation. It's all that they can control.
And I used to teach school before I became an attorney, and you see those things at school where the kids will just go off quickly and start yelling and screaming, and it's like they learned that somewhere. They've heard that conversation somewhere, and it came from home.
What is the saying? Apples don't fall too far from the tree, ever. And it's a really true statement. And I think something you just said, the people who, like, as you being a teacher, you see these kids before. As a teacher, you would see these kids on a daily basis, 5 days a week. I think it's really important to, if you have a case where you're like wondering if there's some form of abuse, talking to the teacher is a really big way to understand and get some insight as to what's going on in that home. Or even if they're separate, asking the teacher, how do these parents communicate with you? What is there aggression shown from one side? Is there one party being completely unreasonable? And I will say, when I've gone to talk to teachers, they are finally happy someone's asking, because it worries them at night. And they're like, I pray for this. I've had one teacher tell me, I pray for this child every day. I'm like, oh, okay, gotcha. You are concerned.
And they're an important resource as well, because especially when parents are split, they a lot of times will notice a difference with a kid coming to school who's tired and grumpy from one household and not the other. May not always be abuse. It may just be, letting them stay up too late, not having rules. But it's something that teachers notice. They know the first, third, and fifth weekends here.
I have a friend who's a teacher, and she was telling me, she goes, I know one kid's coming back to the custodial parent's house after being at the non-custodial parent's house. She's like, they'll be hell on wheels for about 3 days before they settle back down. And I'm like, oh, it's really sad, because theoretically we want them to transition seamlessly, right? And we hope that people are co-parenting, but sometimes that's not always happening. Skip on down to, we've already talked about how children are, witnessing them. Again, I want to stress therapy, because I think different cultures have different views of how therapy is. And it's such a great tool. And I think we're in 2025 now, people are actually realizing the positive effects of therapy. And I love the whole social movement of therapy is positive. It's hoping that they're not seeing it in a negative light. Do you, sometimes when I have someone come in and their child, even if it's the child and the mother and or the father, the child and the parent who's coming in for help, I tell them, I'm like, you need to get in with a therapist. Sometimes I require it. I'm like, if you're going to be with me and my client, I need to know that you are in therapy to help you deal with this.
Yeah, there have been many cases where I've suggested that, and I don't know if I'd necessarily made it a requirement, but it's one of those things I'll continually ask. Got that therapy yet? You signed up for? When's your appointment? You just kind of almost have to berate them into get starting, but then once they get started in it and have had a few sessions, and they'll start like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I know we're counselors of the law. The counseling portion steps in on that a lot, and I'm just I will tell you, the clients who finally go get it, they see their legal fee reduced because they're
Mhm.
they're not calling me to vent about that, and they realize they don't need me for that anymore because they have someone who's helping them with that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's see. The last type of abuse, we're going to do sexual abuse. Lots of sexual abuse starts with grooming. Grooming is when someone builds trust with a child to manipulate and or exploit them, leading to abuse. It could take weeks, months, years, and that person grooming the child can be anyone. It could be a teacher, it could be an uncle, it could be your best friend who sees them only on holidays. It could be the UPS, it could be anybody, you know. What cases have you dealt with and that had grooming in it involved?
Um, Usually it's relative. Occasionally it's been a neighbor, but that's, I think, more rare. It tends to be normally, like you said, when they go off with a relative over a vacation or something of that nature. Um, I think those are the only ones that I've really ever had to deal with. I've had parents accused of it. I've never really had one actually found guilty of it, and that's just such a process in and of itself. But
Yeah.
you have to be real careful with little kids. Then their perception of things and their storytelling versus truth telling can sometimes be very different. But definitely there's signs and things you can watch for.
One thing that I don't think is on here that I have found helpful, especially with working at the hospital with children who've been sexually abused, is let's start teaching our children what the names of real body parts we had. And what was it? My friend, she's a teacher. She said, I had a kid keep telling me her uncle took her cookie. And she was just like, well, tell him to give it back. It's just because she didn't realize that the child meant her private parts. And then when it all came out that she felt so bad, she goes, had I known.
Yeah.
So I just want to preach the importance of, teaching children what the real words are so that when they come to someone and start telling and talking, if she would have said, he touched me down there, it would have been, whoa, you're not going home today. We're calling everyone, and something would have happened sooner. So that's one important thing I would say. It doesn't always have to be like, physical sexual touching of the child. It could be digital, getting them to send inappropriate pictures of themselves, the kind of that nature, or just, talking in an inappropriate manner via text. That in itself that's sexual abuse in itself. Yeah. The age of a child, the younger they are, the harder it is to tell that there's sexual abuse going on. But let's see. Signs of sexual abuse are secrecy. Unexplained gifts is a big one. I would say them doing risky behaviors like drug use or spending too much or too little time online, distressed, inappropriate sexual behavior, and missing time from home unaccounted for. What are some things that you've seen in children who've been sexually abused?
I think a lot of it's just the acting out or maybe drawing pictures. I've seen that in a case where they would draw inappropriate pictures. Like, where did they possibly get that vision in their head? And dad was showing the kid porn and he was like 8. But they would come home and draw pictures. And it's like, mom's like, well, I didn't get that from here. So it's just that one I think was a big one that is the only one I've really ever noticed one in. And just talk, sometimes just the way they talk, exceptionally focused on a particular body part that they're talking about incessantly. And it's like, and sometimes that's a phase. So you kind of be a little careful there, but just the appropriateness, I think, is a lot of it.
Yeah, like, I guess there's a difference between them overhearing something and I think the obsessiveness is really what you kind of want to hone in on, especially when they're younger. Little kids don't say certain things that they learn, especially say if you're below the age of like 7 and under, they're going to tell you exactly what they've been told. They like to parrot their parents or,
Exactly.
So you really, really just have to be diligent and focused on it. I believe that is all of the time we have here today for this. Thank you guys for sitting with us and having the chat. Thank you, Lori, for helping me with this, and we're going to sign out.